breaking down everyday workplace issues and diagnosing the hidden sickness, not just the obvious symptom. Our hosts, James and Kobe.
Did we lose a patient?
No, that's just my lunch.
Hey, thanks for joining us. I'm Kobe. He's James. So let's get started with a question. What expectations damage organizational culture?
Okay, I love the question, but I'm going to take a brief pause and just acknowledge that if you're listening to our last episode, I apologize for the poor sound quality. Apparently, it helps to actually plug in your expensive professional microphone. So this one should be a much better, easier to listen to podcast, but our last one, it was a great conversation and we didn't want to try to fake that, the natural flow of it. So we just went with it. But I just wanted to acknowledge that, that was totally this guy's fault.
Yes, thank you, James.
So what's the expectations that are damaging organizational culture? I'm going to sum it up by saying it's about our performative expectations. It's what are the expectations that we have in the workplace that focus on the look of work rather than the outcome of work, the performance of, this idea that we have to have put on some sort of theater, some sort of act, some sort of play, some sort of performance in order to look like we are actually doing what we're supposed to be doing. That expectation is the single biggest hurdle to developing an authentic workplace culture, because people aren't being authentic. People are acting in a way that they think their managers expect, rather than focusing on, actually performing organizational outcomes. So a great example is this idea of, like, we talk about productivity theater, this idea that success only looks one way. You can only be successful if you're sitting in front of your computer or at your workstation from 9 o'clock in the morning until 5 o'clock at night. All that does, that expectation, is that it forces people to act a certain way, whether or not they are being productive, whether or not they are actually meeting their outcomes. They are forced into this performance, this play acting, in order to meet expectations that you are setting as the leader, as the manager, and it's not helping your organization.
And I think the problem with the performative expectations is that it really isn't just about productivity. It's when we value the visual look, the visual appeal of actions or of components to our workplace and our workplace culture over the actual unsexy things that actually make a difference. And I think that the performative productivity and the performative theater, the productivity theater is good to talk about. But I think before we dig into that, I actually think an even better example is what is the ideas around performative DEI. Because, like, what we mean by performative expectations are prioritizing the visual, easy to see and easy to measure aspects of our culture, rather than the actual changes, the small everyday components, the harder to measure and see easily components that really actually make a difference. And I think that the performative DEI piece is something that is so important to talk about, because a lot of companies that want to do things well with DEI end up, I would say, not intentionally prioritizing, again, the visual, easy to see and measure aspects of DEI, rather than the components that actually make the real difference. And it's the idea of, this is what kind of creates that, the elements of wanting to kind of have the nice picture of all the different, looks and all the different faces and all the different, look how diverse we look.
Yeah.
And regardless of how this functions in the everyday, look at how look at the visual appeal of our DEI efforts, and it doesn't really, and that can actually do more harm than good.
Absolutely. It's the idea, like when we focus DEI on representation without inclusion, right? If we focus on this idea that we, in order to, as if DEI is something that we can actually just, achieve or tick box and say we are done. This idea that if we can just have the right sample of diverse populations in our workplace, then we have accomplished DEI. But if you're not creating that sense of belonging, then your recruitment efforts, your diversity, equity, and initiative, inclusion efforts, they're wasted. We've talked about this idea around, focusing on inclusion first, and, what are some of the biggest problems around our current approaches to DEI. We've got a lot of information that we can talk about on this, but in terms of the performative aspect, if you're focused on what everything looks like for your social media accounts or for your company profile, then you're focused on performative DEI, not on actually creating inclusive, productive workplaces.
Yeah. Like we've done lots of work with different organizations and stuff like that too. And like we see things like, I remember the story of a business or an organization. I believe that might have even been a nonprofit. I can't remember now, but they, were very good at patting themselves on the back for their efforts around LGBTQ, right? Like, the Pride Month, buying everybody and passing out pride flags and putting big posters up and changing the pride symbol on their social media accounts, and really good at making themselves seem like the greatest allies of an organization. But when it came to talking to the employees that identify as part of the LGBTQ community, they were like, yeah, no, that doesn't trickle down into the everyday. There's still this idea of keep it to yourself, leave it at the door, expectation placed on them. They're really, but they also want us who identify to be the first ones to speak up at events or represent the organization as a whole and talk about how great they are
and volunteer for more work that's unpaid just because mean,
it's one of those things where it's again, it's really easy and measurable and visual to put on a good show, but the inauthenticity of it does so much damage, kind of like under the scenes. Like, you may put a lot of effort into your social media trying to brand yourself as a, your employer brand as being very supportive of the community. But if the staff who identify as part of that community say, no, they're not, that does, far more damage, than you could possibly imagine, because that inauthenticity, that really speaks volumes.
Well, that hypocrisy, it causes people to check out, right? If you see your organization talking about how amazing they are to the public and then treating you like garbage, then why would you do anything above and beyond? Why would you do anything that you're not specifically ordered to? And why would you actually stay with an organization that operates in that way?
Well, and the thing too is that it's not always that these organizations are trying to be evil. They're not cartoon villains trying to actually project this false narrative. They're not trying to be they're not trying to gaslight everybody by intention. It often comes back to what we talked about in some of our other episodes. We talked about DEI and inclusion, is the difference between integration and inclusion. Mm-hmm. Because we often think that integration, which is the visible coexistence of different, groups, within the same area or the same location or the same organization, that visual coexistence, we think that is inclusion a lot of the time. We talked about this in our earlier episode that we did kind of the podcast, talking about, are we actually creating inclusion? And the answer is no, we're often creating integration, because the thing is that integration is very visible. The performance of expectations around that visible coexistence where people work alongside each other. They look different and it's easy to see. And, there may be some sense of ability to kind of, tolerate each other, but that's not inclusion. And that doesn't create the culture that we want to create a strong, healthy environment. It just creates the nice picture, that performative expectation of these people that work together and they don't hate each other, so therefore DEI achieved. And I think the misunderstanding of thinking integration and inclusion are the same thing is often where a lot of the results of those well-intended but poorly executed DEI strategies come from.
And you're right. I mean, these 99% of the organizations are not cartoon villains who are, trying to do something nefarious. But that doesn't matter to the person who experiences the hypocrisy. Right? For the person who is experiencing that, the intent is largely irrelevant. It's still going to cause burnout. It's still going to cause disengagement. It's still going to cause job dissatisfaction, regardless of whether or not the organization had the best intentions in the world and just did it poorly, or whether they are just, they are the Mr. Burns cartoon villain trying to actively undermine their employees. It doesn't matter because the outcome is, well, I mean, hey, if we can reference The Simpsons in a podcast episode, I'm happy. But it largely, it doesn't matter. I mean, unfortunately, best intentions don't change the outcome if the person affected for the person who's affected by it.
Yeah, no, you're right. And so we actually have some other content talking about integration and inclusion on our YouTube channel. We have an explainer video like the difference. We recommend, if that's something that you're wondering, which do I have in my workplace? We strongly recommend you check out Solutions Explained by Roman 3, the YouTube channel, and look for that integration versus inclusion, know the difference video, because it'll help break that down.
I think the conversation around performative DEI is really, really good. It's an important one to talk about. And if you are engaging in performative DEI, then unfortunately you are causing yourself more problems than you're solving. But I want to go back to something that I mentioned earlier, which is the idea of productivity theater. This idea that in order to be productive, productivity only looks like one particular thing. We often talk about this in terms of the difference between, are you being busy or are you being productive? The idea that if you're being busy, then you are really just taking as much time as possible to accomplish your goals. The idea that if you're being productive, then you are doing as much as possible within the time frame that you have. Those sound like they're just slight variations, and they are, you can talk about it in terms of splitting hairs, but the distinction is important because most businesses believe that they are reinforcing that people need to be productive, that the way to be successful is that to do as much as you possibly can within the time frame that you have, without realizing that what they reinforce through their compensation, through their expectations, through the way that they structure work, is they actually encourage people to be busy, to take as much time as possible to complete just enough tasks to not get in trouble.
Yeah, and I think that the idea around the busy versus productive tends to be the expectation of how you measure performance. Because you're right, so we have another video actually where we talk about the difference between busy and productive on our YouTube channel, and the idea is about the difference between how you measure time and task. Because the idea is that when we're trying to measure performance, we think of, well, if they're constantly working during the day, that's a successful measurement of performance, regardless of what they're actually accomplishing. If they look like they're working, then that's how me as a manager assumes that they're doing good work. But that really ends up being, almost reinforcing, like you say, the idea of being busy, of just looking like providing that productivity theater, having the look of productivity rather than the actual results of it. And a good example of that was we used to do a lot of, again, pre-COVID, we did a lot of in-person meetings and discussions and sessions with different business groups. I remember we were given this talk about this idea around, about performance management and busy and productive. And a lot of businesses say, oh no, we really focus on productivity. It's in our mission statement, our values. We're a productivity focused business. And then we had one client talk, or we had one participant started talking about their experience in their production facility. And they're talking about how they are very much about outcome focused and that sort of thing like that. And then he made a couple comments about hours and shift. They had the idea of producing I think it was 10 tons per 8-hour shift was kind of how they talked about that. So I remember we kind of stopped and dug into that a little bit more, and we said, okay, just not to pick on you, but we just kind of want to explore this kind of how it plays out in the everyday, and say, so if the performance outcome is an 8-hour shift, your team has to complete 10 tons of the outputs. So we said, okay, what about this? What if your team could produce 10 tons in 6 hours? What would you do then? And say, well, we expect them to try and achieve 12 tons in 6 hours if they met that. Keep the good work going. We're like, okay, what if your team said to you, hey, if we do 10 tons in 6 hours, can we go home early? And he was like, well, if they did that, I'd say, okay, sure, but we're only paying you for the 6 hours. We're not paying you for the full 8. And to us, that really spoke to the heart of it. And a lot of the other participants kind of saw our point that he unintentionally made for us. That what that expectation does is it creates this idea where employees, if they want to get their full day's pay and do the least amount of work, make the 10 tons last 8 hours.
Yeah, I mean, and it makes sense, right? I mean, what incentive are you actually providing to people? The incentive is we're not going to get any more money, regardless of how hard we work. We're not going to get any more time off, regardless of how hard we work. Mm-hmm. So you're incentivizing people to take as long as possible to do the minimum, as much work as they should, mm-hmm. To take that full 8 hours so that they're not killing themselves. Why would they work harder? Why would anybody push to produce more than the bare minimum if you're not providing any form of incentive for them to do so?
Yeah, if this wasn't a client that we work with, so we didn't really get a chance to go beyond this conversation. But if this had been a client, we would have explored ideas around performance management, like saying, to help improve kind of the factors of your workplace and improve things like wellness, or improving the compensation, or those kinds of things. Like, could you look at more ways or more options, provided you had the operational flexibility to? Could you have pay people for an 8-hour shift, but once they complete their quota, then they go home? Or could you look at a week's worth of quota? If it's 50 tons, if they did 50 tons potentially by Thursday, could they have Friday off? Like those types
half day on Friday, or are performance incentives of shift premiums of if you've got 5 8-hour shifts, you're supposed to do 10 tons. If you do 50, great. If you do 60, then you get some sort of incentive, right? If you actually want to encourage performance and you believe that you are incentivizing performance, then you need to actually put your money where your mouth is, either literal dollars or mm-hmm. creating some sort of benefit for people to work harder.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, but if the goal is, we measure performance by how much they're working during their shift, regardless of their output, or as long as they meet their output, then the idea is, again, you're reinforcing busy rather than productive. And this, and again, that's a nice example for the manufacturing, or for some of the more non-desk work piece. But when you look at things like desk work from home has had this massive productivity theater component to it as well, right? Like, I did the video about productivity paranoia, where I talked about one of the problems that we're having is that people are actually being very productive in remote work or work from home, but a lot of managers don't know what that looks like, or they don't know or how do they ensure that their employees are actually being productive. So they use time measuring keystroke measuring kind of pieces to try and validate the performance, rather than shifting to kind of the results and the outcomes. So we have this productivity paranoia from managers worried about, what does performance look like when I can't see you every day?
Mhm.
So if they don't actually have an effective way to measure results and outcomes, then you have employees doing productivity theater where they have to make it look like they're working despite the fact of what they're actually accomplishing, because the results and their outcomes are not enough to prove they're working. And this is kind of the stuff that we have to do when performative expectations are so ingrained in our workplace culture, because that really does create a lot of damage.
It does. And I mean, it's always, I find it so amusing that that topic comes up around work from home, when there is as much or more theater happening in the office of people just sitting at their desks, looking like they are busy, and not like, it's just, this happens everywhere. And it all comes down to, what are you reinforcing and how are you reinforcing it? How are you incentivizing people to perform, to have good performance, not just put on a performance?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, and even this idea of performance kind of most, again, beyond productivity theater and performative DEI, we kind of even see this expectation of performance, or this visual, easy to see pieces kind of in recruitment. It's a little bit different.
Mm.
We kind of see this as almost like a appreciation or expectation of highly extroverted, charismatic people in the job interview pieces. That performance of charisma and extrovertedness gives people an advantage. And again, in some jobs, absolutely, like sales or even this kind of leadership, you want that kind of charismatic, piece where people are drawn to you. But a lot of jobs, that's not a requirement. And you have a lot of great, introverted, quiet people, reflective people, who would be rock stars in the performance, in the measuring results, or the results and outcomes of the job, but may not look like the expectation around them performing in the job. Or it's hard to visualize them because they're so quiet that they get, they're behind the 8 ball. They're at a disadvantage, because we want that performance in the job interview as well.
And I think a great example is the client that we worked with a few years ago, the small business that was, they had been growing, and they were gotten to a point where they realized that they needed a financial comptroller.
Right. Yeah.
So they were hiring for this, senior leadership role, absolutely. But it was a, they were looking for somebody like a CPA. They were looking for all of these different aspects for the financial management of the company, in order to ensure that its continued growth. We did the recruitment with them. We did the recruitment part for them, interviewed with them, and helped them screen their applicants. And I can remember very clearly. So there were 2 clients in particular, or 2 applicants in particular, who kind of stood out for this client. One in a good way, and one in a not so good way. There was one applicant who was very personable, very bubbly, very outgoing, and they seemed to build they were very good at building that initial rapport, that having a really positive first impression. Contrasted with another applicant who was extremely qualified, had ticked every single box that the client was looking for, had the designations, had done this exact type of work before, not in the same industry, but for a company at a similar growth stage. Like, talking to this person, and the interview with this person was phenomenal, because they were so knowledgeable. They were very process focused. They knew exactly what they needed to do to set up the financial management for a small business and to carry it out. But they were not the most engaging person to talk to. They were fairly reserved. It took a little bit of probing to really get some information out of them about themselves. Talking about their job, talking about their area of expertise, phenomenal, no problems there. But they not nearly what, the classical extrovert of, outgoing and bubbly and, those, that was not who this person was. But holy crap, could they do the job? And
Yeah.
I remember the conversations and back and forth with the client talking about, well, what does they were leaning towards the bubbly, outgoing personality who honestly they had some of the qualifications, but they'd never done this job before. Right. They probably could have learned it. I'm not saying that they weren't a good applicant, but there was an obviously better applicant that we had talked to, but they weren't as outgoing. And this idea that, well, what do you actually need from this role? This is a financial comptroller role for your organization. You want somebody who is very competent, who is very knowledgeable, who is very process focused, who has done this before in order for you to achieve your growth goals.
Yeah, especially because that skill set of the financial expertise didn't exist in the organization, that this person had to be the expert.
Yeah, this was the first role of that type. It's not like they were coming into an established process. They needed somebody who could step in and build a solid financial process for the company. Yeah.
And I mean, it's one of those things where the more experienced candidate was a little boring, but at the same time, they weren't going to be, speaking publicly, doing sales. They didn't have any direct reports, so there wasn't a team they had to motivate and stay going. They were kind of be put in the back office and churning out the results and making sure that everything, all the I's were dotted and the T's were crossed. And they would have been able, and they would have been so happy doing that. But they just, as far as the expectations about what you want in, an applicant, a new employee, you want that motivation, enthusiasm, but, and that charisma, but you don't always need it but it's idea of that expectation of all employees have to be bubbly and this and that, to kind of fit into our existing culture, when really that's not going to be the best person for the job. And sometimes it's a matter of realizing what is it that you actually want.
What do you actually need in the role? Do you need somebody who's can actually do the job, or do you need somebody who's going to be, on display, the king of the company picnic?
Right? Well, actually, that's actually a really good thing to kind of build on to too, is that when it comes to kind of the performative piece, it's not necessarily just about the expectation on the individual employee. Sometimes the way that organizations talk about their workplace culture, we have a great workplace culture because we have this foosball table in the break room. We have this beautiful, our values are muraled on the wall when you walk in, or we have this amazing company picnic.
Yeah, the values muraled on the wall thing, man. You might as well just slap a live, love, laugh decal up there for all the good it's going to do you. But you're right, though. We take the same performative approach to our workplace culture, right? We try to make things. We try to paint a picture, right? We try statements on our website, and our values plastered on the walls so that people can see them when they walk in. Even I'm not against annual company events, but using them as your sole engagement strategy or your sole kind of piece there. Anyways, we've got many episodes that go into the problematic approach that has. But even this idea that, like, a lot of companies will use an annual barbecue or company event to put on more performative aspects, where they will hold all recognition and rewards to showcase during the company event, which in itself is not terrible if you're also providing that recognition and rewards in real time, and you want to also acknowledge the great successes that people are accomplishing to the entire organization. But that's not how I've seen most companies use these types of events. They'll use a company picnic event of an awards ceremony as this big performative display.
Right.
where all they're really worried about is this idea that look at how successful we have been because we are giving out plaques for 5 years of service and 10 years of service and 20 years of service. And, those things aren't bad in and of themselves, but when they are focused on the performance rather than actually rewarding people in real time and acknowledging the tremendous contributions that your staff make to your organization, it's problematic.
Yeah, and I think that one of the problems with the performative pieces around workplace culture is when the focus is on the visual fun, right? The social media posts of us at the company picnic or on the retreat, or this is the fun stuff we do. We're having a foosball tournament in the middle of the day because we're just a fun place to work. And I mean, we talked about, we talked about a lot of this stuff, in recent episodes about employee engagement and how we're doing it wrong and how we actually make it work. So make sure you check those out. But a lot of it too is around, the focus on happiness rather than on engagement, right? We think that employee happiness is the same thing as an engaged employee.
Right.
An engaged employee is really more about motivation and enthusiasm. But a lot of the stuff is, again, what are we trying to get? We're trying to get the easy to see visual measurable pieces that prove we have all these things when really they don't. But I think what you said before, you kind of said this kind of running through a lot of the stuff that we talked about, we're kind of villainizing a lot of these things that are common in most workplaces, but we're not. I think it's important for us to say they're not actually bad on their own.
Mm-hmm.
They're not actually bad pieces as part of a larger plan, having I guess the story about the LGBTQ, like the flags, pride flags, and everything. Those aren't a bad thing.
No,
right? If they're part of a larger strategy that actually walks the walk, is not just the sizzle, it's actually the steak. Then those things can be good. Just like the company picnic, it's not they're not a bad thing. But if they're all that you're doing, or you lean too heavily on it, and they're not actually part of an actual system that actually makes a difference and improves the day-to-day actions, or extroverted employees aren't a bad thing, right?
No.
It's about are you only trying to hire people because they wow you when with their charismatic presence, when that's really not what the job requires. So it's important to realize that a lot of things we've kind of been saying are not good. It's important to realize that, again, if the only thing you want is the performance, is the visual aspect, then they're not good.
Yeah.
But if they are part of an actual system that actually makes a difference and improves the daily lives of everybody, then they can be an excellent component to a much larger plan.
Well, and you're right. I mean, going back to our original question is, what expectations are destroying or holding back or limiting our organizational culture? And these actions are important. The things that, like having company picnics, yeah, they're great. But we default to the performative. We default to this showiness because it's easier for us to measure. Right?
Yeah.
It's easier for us to tick a box and say, we have accomplished this because I can see it. I can see it in front of me. We held a company picnic, check. We held an awards ceremony, check. We hired a bubbly candidate, check. We, whatever else, we've hired a diverse workforce, check. We can see these things, but that tick box approach to workplace culture is a very short-sighted strategy. I'd be hesitant to call it a strategy at all, but we'll say it's a short-sighted strategy. It's not going to accomplish and build what we consider to be a productive, inclusive, profitable workplace culture, which should be the outcome. Right? We're engaged as businesses. We are engaging in these activities. Yes, they are the right thing to do. There is a moral imperative around diversity, equity, and inclusion. It is the right thing to do. It is also the profitable thing to do if done properly. And we cannot necessarily separate those things. I don't think that it's bad to approach these things from a standpoint of how is this going to help better our company, right? And there are direct bottom line benefits to all of these things, but they have to be done with intention, with strategy, and not from a performative visual standpoint.
No, you're right. Okay, I think I'll do a bit of a wrap up. I think this was a good conversation. We got to vent a lot of our frustrations.
Isn't that the point of the podcast? Just
I believe so.
To us vent and rant.
So, what expectations damage organizational culture? Well, what they really comes down to is the idea of performative expectations that are easy visual things that you can see and measure and point to that, you know, are really not making the difference that we actually need, which is about improving the day-to-day employee experience. Things like performative DEI, where we use tokenism, we put stuff on social media that talks about how great we are, but we actually don't walk the walk, where we focus on integration and having that visual coexistence of differing groups rather than inclusion, where employees feel like they belong and are accepted in their workplace. We engage in productivity theater, where we actually value being busy and using as much time as we can with the tasks that we have, rather than being productive, where we do as many tasks as we can with the time that we have. We have productivity paranoia, where employers don't believe their work from home employees are actually, you know, actually being productive. So they put in a lot of more visual pieces so they can see how well they're working, rather than measuring their actual outcomes and the results, which makes employees do productivity theater where they look as busy as possible when the boss is around or the boss is noticing, so that the boss thinks they're actually working. Sometimes this trickles into how we recruit, and we want the visual extroverted employees, regardless of whether or not those qualities that may kind of wow us in the interview, if those qualities aren't really part of the job itself, then we may be putting that expectation needlessly on the applicants. And we look at performative workplace culture, where we focus on the fun, where we do things about putting on a big show and having a lot of things to point to about how great our culture is, where we also may be having problems with micromanagement and, you know, lack of respect and all these other issues, but we want that polished veneer and that polished look rather than the actual meaningful results. So it's important for us to realize that the performative expectations, how things look, things we can point to, are not actually going to move the needle on making a more productive, more inclusive, and more profitable workplace culture. All right. So that about does it for us. For a full archive of our podcast and access to the video version hosted on our YouTube channel, visit roman3.ca/podcast. Thanks for joining us.
For more information on topics like these, don't forget to visit us at roman3.ca. Side effects of this podcast may include improved retention, high productivity, increased market share, employees breaking out in spontaneous dance, dry mouth, aversion to the sound of James's voice, desire to find a better podcast.